a while. But I thought, given the fallout from Hungary, the situation, and implications for Europe, Russia, and everything, it would be worth having a deeper dive into the Russian perspective, or what people who look at Russia, and how this is going to impact Putin and Zelensky and Ukraine. I mean, I've been so consumed by the war in Iran that I haven't had much time to focus on the war in Ukraine explicitly, albeit I think that the primary big shifts have been Zelensky's efforts to keep Ukraine in the sort of in the media cycle, to get coverage and ensure that Ukraine is not forgotten about. And certainly Putin and the economy are something. But that's all what we're going to dive into with a friend of the channel, Jason J. Smart, who's just joined us. So excited to hear what he thinks about Hungary and all that coming up. Jason, hello, how are you? We're joined by
Piotr, how are you?
the live stream. I'm good. I'm very interested to hear your thoughts on Hungary, on Ukraine, Russia, Putin's reaction. Yeah, lot here to talk about. I think your wins are not exceptional.
You're already in New York?
No, I'll be in New York tomorrow afternoon.
Okay. How long are you in town for?
I'm in town for 5 days, going
Nice.
to an event, which I guess I should share with people. Actually, I'm going to an event with being organised by the Renew Democracy Initiative.
RDI.
Yes, RDI, and
You're gonna be there with my pal Ariel Epstein.
Yeah, we've had Ariel on the show before, and I hosted Ben Hodges earlier today, and it turns out that he'll be there. So he's already,
of course, he will. He's on the board.
He's already ordered me to buy him a drink. So that's
he's a nice guy.
Yeah, I'm excited to do that. And Gary Kasparov will be there, John Bolton, Mark Kelly, I think. So yeah, quite an exciting an array of people, but lots of exciting conversations, hopefully, for the channel and for people watching to tune in for. So be sure to click that notification bell if you haven't already. But Jason, let's jump into this conversation. Late night here for me in London, but I guess what I would just say is simply, right now we've had a crazy situation with Hungary and the aftermath of the election. And as someone who's been heavily involved in and around Eastern Europe for a long time, what are your thoughts? How big a deal do you think this is?
Well, I mean, it's quite significant from a few different levels. I think first and foremost, if we were to look at this from the side of what this means for Europe as a whole, as well as for Ukraine, obviously, but also for Russia, as well as for the United States, I think Hungary by far was the most important, or I wish to say, influential country in Europe across both sides of the Atlantic. And I mean that seriously. Is when you think about the fact of they were the ones that are able to stop so much progress in Europe, just one country by themselves, but also the influence they had in the United States was pretty overwhelming. I mean, I don't think a lot of people appreciate how much they were sponsoring, whether it was CPAC, Conservative Political Action Committee, which brought in tons of U.S. congressmen, senators to Hungary for that event. Tucker Carlson's father was a registered lobbyist for Hungary. Hungary had an incredible amount of influence in the United States, far beyond what I think a lot of people understand. But within Europe itself, we saw obviously it was the country that was able to dictate what would happen in a lot of circumstances due to their veto power. Now, that's pretty amazing. Just consider how small Hungary is and the fact that it was able to have such a very important role. But because of that, it was very important to Russia as well. Without Hungary, I think that is actually a substantial loss for Russia, much more so than say Iran. And the reason I make that argument is simply that in the case of Iran, obviously there's a strategic relationship, there's an important relationship. I'm not downplaying that. But in the short term, it was less impactful than the relationship of Hungary. Hungary was able to block $90 billion going to Ukraine. Now, imagine if they start taking the money that's currently being held in banks in Europe that's frozen from the Russian government and start giving that over to Ukraine now that Hungary's out of the way. Or let's imagine they give more weaponry. If we were to see a major break in the lines tomorrow in Ukraine, that is something that could be very destabilizing for the Putin regime as a whole. This is something that becomes much more existential for Putin. And that's where I think that a lot of people sort of don't see how Hungary was such a very important piece in this puzzle. And now it's going to be very interesting to see how it plays out further.
Yeah, we had a really interesting conversation with someone from Princeton about more of the law side of it. And I guess one of the biggest misconceptions or confusions, perhaps deliberately so, by people with an agenda was that um, Orban and his successor, they're very different. But in some ways they're not, because I just want your thoughts, because they're still going to be importing Russian energy, and they have said that they're not going to look to diversify away until there's a more reliable alternative. So how much does this signify a departure from Orbanism, if that's the
I
right
mean,
word to use?
realistically, frankly, I don't think it's really matters. Let's talk about what this means in the grand scheme of how many dollars worth this is. It's not substantial. This is not something that's going to change the war for Russia. What does change the war for Russia is the veto power over military assistance as well as financial assistance for Ukraine. That is very important. Also, being able to hold up NATO membership for Ukraine or EU membership for Ukraine is very substantial. So the fact that they are taken out of this equation, it's pretty important. And that's why ultimately, as I said, I think that a lot of people don't appreciate that Hungary was able to play a very unique role, once in a lifetime for Hungary, where it can be sort of this cornerstone of so much that's happening, the linchpin. And now that Orban's gone, I'm sure that the government will pursue populist politics, and that might include things like gas that you mentioned. But as a whole, will they be willing to be obstructionist, as we saw in the case of Hungary? I don't think they will, because one, the financial cost is very high. I don't remember the number off the top of my head. I want to say it's about $5 billion a year that's been held up by Europe due to the fact that Hungary was considered to have some policies that ran astray of European values. Um, but the current government, the incoming government, I should say, is not going to be one that's likely to pursue that. And if you look at the other countries in Europe, like for instance, everyone talks about Slovakia, FICO, they can't take that sort of economic risk to have sort of a boycott of the European Union. That's something that would be detrimental to them, and also they're not popular enough in their own country to do that. In the case of Orban, he had pretty astounding numbers in past elections. He had a super majority routinely. That's pretty amazing. On local elections, they also did really well. So when he's not competing against something like that, or sorry, when we look at these other countries that are not in a system like that, that changes things quite a bit. Obviously Bulgaria, a lot of people are worried about the elections on Sunday. That's going to be a candidate who will win that's perhaps pro-Russian. Again, Bulgaria doesn't have the economic resources necessary or the stamina to be able to withstand boycotting the European Union per se. I just think it's totally unrealistic. So I think at this point, this is something that will change the dynamics of Europe. It will definitely affect American politics as well, but it will definitely be something that is a boon to Ukraine and to the detriment of Russia.
But do you not think that it's a case of, okay, he won't block decisions by the EU, but he's not going to support them either. So he's not going to try to weaken European or EU decision making, but he's not going to streamline it either. Or you
Uh,
again, because of the magnitude of the topics involved, it doesn't make a difference.
His actual politics towards Europe, I think, will probably evolve with time. His positions, like all politicians during the electoral season, might shift quite a bit when it gets to actually governing. I
Mm.
don't know what exact demands he has of Europe or what necessities he has or what Europe can offer him. That being said, I think as a whole, his prioritization of events is not going to be fighting with Europe. That's not a very winning strategy. We just saw that. Much better for him is to prioritize how he can improve the quality of lives of voters in his own country. That should be first and foremost in everything that he does. That's how you win elections. And I think that's what he's going to focus on. Orban, one of the things that surprised me the most about him, for a guy who is intelligent, a guy who's obviously got years of experience in politics, there he took such a narrow path of continuing this fight with Europe, this fight with Ukraine, this fight where he's sort of defending Russia and different things that would be perceived that way, at least by his voters. Um, I don't know why he just chose to go off so far the deep end because it was just something that was so obviously not working out well for him. The polling numbers were showing that things were not going well. He could have easily changed course. He could have, a month before the elections, come up and said, due to the fact that I'm very pro-European, of course, and I'm very supportive of Ukraine, we're going to be willing to vote in favor of this for whatever justification you give. I'm sure they could find a way politically to make it work to justify why he didn't take this sort of position that was ostracizing himself, not only from the Europeans, but also from his own voters. But he chose not to do that. He chose to maintain this very hardline position. Then the end simply did not pay off.
Yeah, Peter Magyar's victory was across the spectrum, wasn't it? He appealed to everybody by saying, "Look at what Orban's done to Hungary: the cronyism, the corruption, the non-existent economy, inflation, etc." So now going forward, Poland has obviously had a return to pro-Europeanism a few years ago. Now we've got Hungary shifting. That leaves Slovakia and Robert Fico. So
Mhm.
really, what is there of Putin's influence in Europe? Serbia, okay, perhaps, but in the European Union itself, Bulgaria, you
It's
mentioned.
it's pretty nominal at this point. I mean, obviously, Russia is linked to a lot of sort of fringe parties at this point. Doesn't mean they're always going to be fringe. Look at Le Pen in France. Look at the polling numbers coming from France. These parties could easily rise and become something greater. But at present, they are not a major force in the way that Fidesz was within Hungary. Fidesz, it's if you look at the polling numbers and you look at the election results in Hungary. Look at a few years ago, was it 4, 6 years ago? I'm trying to remember which year it was. Look at the election results at the local level. The map is just covered with Fidesz. It's pretty amazing how profoundly supported they were by the population. But at some point, he just truly went awry of that, and he lost the focus. The reason that he should have been standing up to the Europeans, if that's what the population wants to hear, is because you're doing it to defend the interest of your people. And it's something that actually the message discipline of Orban's people is usually pretty good. They said, we're always putting Hungary first. Why can you be angry with us? We're only putting Hungary first. It's great messaging. That being said, obviously it was a little bit more than that, but the people also didn't identify with that. At some point, it passed the level of being believable and to a point of no longer representing what the voters felt was truly defending their interest. It was something that was defending his own interest or something askew from what the national interest was. And he went very hardball on that. And it's very hard to imagine what led him down that road, but he chose to go down that path. But within Europe as a whole, no, I can't think of anyone else that's really going to have that sort of a uh, ability to truly change European history as he was able to.
So diving deeper into the Russian angle, Putin angle, then. So how strategic a loss for Moscow is this? If you can put a number on it, put a.
It's substantial. I mean, the thing is, we'll have to see where it plays out next. But over time, since Sunday, I've contemplated this quite a bit. I've looked up a lot of the numbers of how much was going in to Hungary, how much Hungary is able to hold up, what this meant in several different negotiations that were going on simultaneously, such as EU membership for Ukraine or weapons for Ukraine, or choose what it's going to be. A lot of different things. Now, if Hungary's taken off the map, that's no longer going to be an issue. That is no longer going to be a major obstacle coming from there. I think that's going to make things move much faster for Ukraine. Now, why that's so important is right now within Russia itself, there's some significant problems. I mean, truly significant problems that are getting worse. And I look at the battlefield as the most obvious example. The amount of battlefield that Russia took in January was less than half of that by February. And in March, it's been less than half of that. At this point, there's been a 556% increase in the casualties per square kilometer taken since January. That's extraordinary. But more than that, the Russian military, up until last month, was running a deficit of about 9,000 soldiers per month, where they're not able to get enough new soldiers to make up for the ones that were being depleted, that is, killed or injured. Uh, but today it looks like even though they were aiming to have 409,000 new soldiers recruited this year, best case scenario, they're not going to beat 290,000. That's leaving a very big hole in what they expected to have. Now we see that the destruction of equipment on the battlefield has also dramatically increased in the past couple of months. In fact, depending on what type of equipment it is, whether it's artillery or vehicles or tanks, it's on average it's about 7.3, 7.1 times more, or to 9.5 times more than it was in January. That's a huge increase to see that much more destruction in a short period of time. Russia, once again, can't come up with the cash to fix that. And as they can't, that is something that is going to have dividends. And those dividends are going to be that the battlefield becomes much softer. It's going to be harder for the Russians to defend their lines with less equipment, with less technology. We saw that Belousov, who's the Minister of Defense of Russia, the message came out 2 days ago where he described it as being a critical situation, the lack of drones and the lack of technology, but also the lack of soldiers on the front for Russia. Once again, I think it's important to reiterate that if the Russian lines were to break tomorrow, the effects of that are very hard to guess how that would play out, but that could be very dramatic for what that means for Russia as a whole.
So if you're sitting in the Kremlin today or in the past few days, As you said, you've been thinking about this since Sunday. How are you processing this result? What is going through Putin's mind? What's going through the broader Kremlin's mind, and well, especially Dmitry Medvedev? I'd love to know what that alcoholic is thinking.
It's a good question. What Dimitri's thinking. Um, well,
If what is he
I think does he think? So there's a few different things I think they'd have to wonder about. One is that they did have a team that was there trying to help before the elections, and they did send what would be for the Kremlin the A-level team, the really best people to try to help. It doesn't appear that had the desired effect. But more than that, it's I think for them something where they realized they were not going to win because in the last few days, if you look at the statements that came out, even if you look at national TV in Russia, they started to already posit that it was possible that they wouldn't win. That what would happen now if all of a sudden they lose, and so the fact that they started talking about that so much was made very clear that they also understood what was happening. So I think going ahead, it's probably real. I mean, they're not crazy. They understand what this means. They can look at the numbers themselves and see that things are not going the right direction. The leaked phone calls between Orban and his Russian counterpart, between Lavrov and the foreign minister of Hungary, they were damning. They were horrible. They were truly like the political plague. Something worse than that's hard to imagine. And even worse, perhaps, is that the foreign minister of Hungary didn't deny it, but rather said that it's illegal to be wiretapping people, and they've been doing that a lot recently. So admitted that it was true. But all this combined, I think for Russia, they probably realized that they were in a bad situation and they weren't going to be able to pull through on it. Publicly, of course, they'll never say anything. But look at Russia in the past couple of years; it's losing a lot of territory. We've seen in the case of what happened in the case of Assad in Syria. We see what happened in Maduro in Venezuela. They're still connected, of course, to Venezuela. There's still very good relations, but it seems that is also changing. The case of Cuba, the country is truly collapsing at this point. I mean, truly collapsing. It's a terrible situation they're in. Look what we have going on the rest of the map, though, and it's not like a lot's going very well for Russia today on the global scene. I guess Burkina Faso is going pretty well. Look what's going on in Madagascar. Look what's going on in Mali. Look what's happening in Niger. I wouldn't say that globally things are going great for Moscow at this point. And I think that there's a lot of reasons for them to be concerned as to what this means in the grand scheme. Now, the Russian military bloggers have also brought this up. It's not just something from the outside. They are bringing this up, and they do talk about it. The fact that Russia is being pushed into a box at this point, and they're alarmed by it, which, if I was them, I'd also be alarmed because this is not boding well. This is not a very good sign as to how things are turning out.
Yeah, it's the extraterritorial implications of this, I think, are huge. The Russians seem to have a bit of a footprint in the Sahel in Central Africa, but I mean, how far can that be leveraged? They've lost Venezuela. They've seen a severe undermining of Iran, although I don't think it's doing wonders for Trump either. China and that relationship is always quite complicated. The North Koreans, not sure. It doesn't leave many partner states, not allies. I use that obviously word particularly partner states. So what strings can Putin pull, if any, to try to influence Europe or try to get a better footing? Or he is out of chess moves.
So the thing is that Russia ultimately, I think, will probably go a different direction. The fact is that they can't pull the same strings they did before. And Orban, at the end of the day, was a very successful strategy. It worked great. But now today, facing the circumstances they are, it's hard to predict where they will take that, how they understand it, how they interpret that. But I think one very reasonable interpretation of events would be that given the fact that Russia in the past couple of years has engaged in so much terrorism within Europe, whether it was the poisonings, the arsons, trying to incite riots, all these different things, it's quite possible they turn to that again. I mean, if you're trying to obtain, first we have to state what would be their objective. Why would they do that? So the objective of Russia is what? Ultimately, for Russia, it is a greater priority to get their objectives met in Ukraine than it is to Hungarian domestic politics, right? Hungary as a country, it's great, but that wasn't ever their priority. It doesn't really, they don't care. It doesn't change anything for them in the fundamental sense of it. But what happens in Ukraine, if they were to lose there in a bad way, that's something they would care about a lot. So if their objective is really to influence events in Ukraine, everything else is just a proxy to realize that objective, to realize the end state in Ukraine that they want, then I think that what they'd have to do is turn to a different method. A different method could be something such as more drones going into European capitals. Just imagine something like a small incursion in somewhere like a Baltic state for a few hours and leave. a lot of people have this misperception about how NATO works. I mean, when the Baltic states join it, and I know a lot of people who worked on negotiations for that, when they negotiated to join NATO, it's not like this thing works within an hour. If the Russians were occupy this place for 2 hours, some village somewhere, and leave, the Russians would feel that to be a success because they showed that they stood up to NATO and NATO didn't respond. Now, NATO doesn't work in a way that's retroactive, that it's going to go back and punish you for what you've done. That's not the purpose. It is a defensive organization, it's to preserve your state. So if they were to do that, the Russians feel maybe emboldened that they could do that. Then they could sort of have influence in Europe again. They could be negotiating again from a position of what they perceive to be strength, and that it could give them a new leverage that they don't currently have now that they can't just depend on their proxy of Orban. There's a lot of different, and I'm just giving this out as an example. I'm not saying that's going to happen for sure, but that's just an example of something that could happen because now you have to find new ways to give relevance to your country to bring yourself into the general discussion of what's happening in the continent.
Yeah, well, there's an example from where I'm sitting right now. London, Britain has been facing a particularly uncharacteristic set of incursions or provocations in the past week. 5 days around the Yantar, the surveillance boats, the lasers that were fired at British aircraft a few months ago, and now these three submarines and the Russians using warships to accompany tankers through the English Channel. So, you know, what does the shift in Hungary mean for the EU and Britain's collective response against those sorts of actions, in and around the British Isles?
Well, in all cases, it's a positive that Orban lost. I mean, there's no doubt about that. I think that Russia, at the same time, we've seen historically that when Vladimir Putin has really stood up to, and I said a very small example, when they started sending the oil tankers to Venezuela after the U.S. went there and put the embargo, immediately after taking Maduro out, the Russians didn't go against that. In fact, when their ships was taken, in the end, yes, the crew was given back to Russia, etc. But still, that wasn't guaranteed. I think that the Russians realize that they do have a limited amount of capital that they can afford to spend on this. They got a lot of problems at home. They can't afford to really escalate things to a level where it gets serious, to a level where they'd actually have to come and meet with force another country because frankly, they would just lose. It would not be good for them. It would be something that turned out disastrously. A perfect scenario for Russia, and it's been this way historically, I think, with Putin, is when you can do something provocative. As I said, I'm just once again using the silly example of taking some village. There's sort of an exclave. Look, it's not actually an exclave. It's more like a peninsula of Lithuania in the southeast part of the country that reaches into Belarus. Let's imagine you roll into there, sit around for a few hours and leave. What's going to be the actual result of that in real terms? Probably not a lot. But how would that be perceived at home? Because remember, all foreign policy at all times is always made for only one reason, which is domestic concern. So if it's for domestic concern that you, the leader of the country, realize somehow that benefits your own dynasty, your own leadership of the country, or your own population, which is not how Putin thinks, but many leaders do think that way, then you might realize, listen, this might be a way that we can get back on the playing field. This will give us some leverage that we don't currently have, and we have very little to lose. I mean, no one's going to start a nuclear war with Russia because of this. Nobody's going to go and invade Moscow because of this. They're just not. And if you think they will, then fine. They just tried to blow up civilian airliners in Poland, Lithuania, and what was the result of that? Nothing. Europe did nothing. And time again, we've seen this. So if you're Putin, I think that there would be a very reasonable argument to make that's worth tossing the dice, seeing how the Europeans respond, and seeing if you could use that then to have them backpedal from their hardline positions because they worry about their own security. But let's take one step further. Let's imagine, and I think this is actually more Machiavellian, which is why it makes more sense, is that if you were to look at the situation like Putin would, what's costing you right now inside of Ukraine is the fact that simply your military cannot keep up with what the Ukrainians are doing. The strikes are becoming more and more significant. Russia is truly out of air defense. They have about 68 air defense units around Moscow, a city of about 20 million people. Around Valdai, the house that Putin has, there's 27 units, which is pretty amazing. But either way, they don't have enough right now in the front lines, hence why we've seen repeated attacks on different facilities. We just saw in Lugansk last week. We saw at the factories at Cherpetsk, the one making ammonia. There's been attacked twice in the past 2 weeks. We saw it in Ustuga. We saw at the oil facilities in Primorsk multiple attacks by the Ukrainians. But how is it possible over multiple days, multiple attacks? Why wasn't there air defense? They simply don't have enough. So if you're in that sort of a situation, what the best thing you could do realizing you have long range missiles that are effective, they've taken out a lot of the energy in Ukraine. You would want to make sure there's less air defense for Ukraine. That's something that could actually be a paradigm shift, because you need a paradigm shift right now. You can't afford to keep fighting a war on the battlefield where you're just taking these losses and not getting anything for it. The way you would have form a paradigm shift is, let's imagine you were to send some drones into Europe, various European capitals. People go ballistic. They start absolutely going nuts. As a result of that, stoking up this incredible fear, the politicians there would very likely be responsive to their populations and say, we need air defense for our own population. We need Patriot missiles for them. We support Ukraine, etc. It's not because we want to cut them off, but simply we can't afford to give it away if tomorrow we might need it. And that's something I think that Russia would do. Look at the case of Denmark. Denmark gave away the last of its air defense, and I think it was air defense last summer. A lot of missiles. They gave a lot of things to Ukraine, but then they started to have some problems with the United States. You never know what's going to pop up tomorrow. So giving away a lot of your weaponry, a lot of your defensive weapons, even, is something that can come with risk that you don't foresee necessarily. In the case of Russia, I think they might perceive this as being their opportunity then to strike a general fear, a sense of need to preserve your weapon supplies, which thereby would be something that creates a starvation of weapons within Ukraine, which serves their interest.
Yeah, it's certainly not looking great for Moscow at the moment, and that's without even going into the economy, which we will do so, I think, next week with Constantine. But Jason, I'm curious then to flip this around for Ukraine. What does this do for their strategic position, and how much can they leverage it in potential negotiations? There were rumors of them of peace talks being revisited. Putin actually keen to look into it. I think that was covered by Zelensky's own top negotiator, right? So what do you think this does for Ukraine's position?
Well, we have to remember that Ukraine is in a interesting position because a lot of the force that's being put on Ukraine right now is not internal in nature. Um, there is definitely internal demands for ending the war. There's a lot of problems domestically in Ukraine, but it's not as severe as ostry, sharp, as many people might believe it to be. Acute is the word I'm looking for. Acute as many people might believe it to be. Now, what's interesting though is that right now they are in a very good position to sort of wait it out and let the Russians continue to burn themselves down. The Russians simply can't keep up with things. What is it? It's about 15, 20-kilometer wide kill zone they've created with drones, so the Russian soldiers just can't get through. When you have that sort of a thing where the Russians simply can't get through, they get destroyed, you can keep going for a very long time, and it costs very little to keep going. The Russians, though, will eventually run out of money. They'll eventually run out of soldiers, and that's sort of a fascinating position to be in. So one of the unfortunate situations that Ukraine is in today, I think, is that the United States put so much pressure, undue pressure, on them to negotiate and they give away territory. The total absurdity of that, for anyone who's never been to Donbass, which I go to Donbass quite regularly, is the part of Donbass that's not currently occupied. A large part is occupied by Russia. In the case of Lugansk, it's over 99% is currently occupied by Russia. But still, the part right now, currently, of Donetsk Oblast that is not occupied is the most defensible part of the territory. It's impossible for Russia to take it. In fact, there was an estimate, I think it was British intelligence last year, that said that for them to take the rest of the territory, they would face up to 1 million more casualties. That's simply phenomenal. Like, you mind, Russia's been trying to take this territory since more than a decade now, and they still haven't been able to take it. And they've suffered incredible losses. In fact, look at just Pokrovsk. 1/5 of all Russian casualties were to take Pokrovsk and the surrounding area. Pokrovsk is a town that nobody knew existed before the war started. I mean, absolutely nobody knew there was a town called Pokrovsk. And the fact that a fifth of the Russian casualties out of 1,300,000 casualties, a fifth were killed or injured there. What are they gaining exactly? It's a total wash. So it's unfortunate that today Ukraine's being pressured to give up territories that are not currently under occupation because there's no need to. It's not like, Ukraine's going to lose them eventually if it doesn't give them up. There's no guarantee that they will ever be lost. We're not in a situation where there's a fire sale necessary. Ukraine can definitely continue to put the heat on Russia. And Russia, especially Putin today, look at the decisions he's making. Look where they had the meeting 2 weeks ago with the senior people in the oligarchy of Russia. You saw they had a meeting with the top richest people in Russia, let's say. Now, according to U.S. intelligence, about they lost, these people that were in the meeting and others, they lost about $67 billion due to the full-scale invasion, due to the sanctions that came on and everything else, money being frozen. Vladimir Putin, so you can guess that their total net worth is, in the hundreds and hundreds of billions. Actually, I want to say it's 366 billion was the estimate. Vladimir Putin said, we need you guys to come forward and cough up some cash to help with this war, to help with the national budget. The first month of the year, they had a federal budget deficit of about $45 billion, which is huge for Russia. And in fact, German intelligence says that it was probably about 30% more than that, 40% more than that, sorry. But in the end, the fascinating part, he said, we need you guys to cough up some cash. Now, these are people who all became extremely wealthy, multi-billionaires, thanks to Vladimir Putin. He allowed them to privatize industries in the country and to maintain that. Because there's other people that privatized industries that then had taken away by Putin. But he allowed them to keep their industries, to stay super wealthy. He said, well, I need you to help us now. I need you to give us some money. He was only able to raise about $1.3 billion out of them. $1.3 billion out of $336 billion. That's not a lot. That's what, 0.36%. It's not a very impressive number. And it shows you how bad it is economically.
So, switching to NATO then, what I'm interested in is about Trump's been, well, I love the Vance effect, where he effectively kills off the Pope, causes the Islamabad peace talks to fail, and for Orban to lose the election, right? But he's also threatening NATO to leave. He can't. I've done plenty of coverage on that. But what I am interested in is what your thoughts are of if we've got a more active Hungary now, NATO minus, this idea NATO without the United States. Ukraine somehow joins NATO at some point. Peter has said that he's not a fan of Ukraine being fast-tracked into either NATO or EU. So what do you think this means for NATO in the short to medium term? Or it doesn't really matter?
I mean, I think that, listen, it's a normal country, so having multilateral security guarantees is not surprising. The fact that it's going to be outside of NATO is also not surprising. It's completely normal. That's what countries do. There's a lot of countries in the world that have security guarantees with the U.S. and they're not parts of NATO. So I don't think that's anything extraordinary, and it's the wisest thing that Ukraine can do. I mean, it's something that I've said since before the full-scale invasion began. That should be the top priority for Ukraine, not NATO. NATO will eventually come, but for today, go for as much as you can get right now on the table. Get as much as you can out of the countries that you can count on. Don't worry about the countries that you can't. Pushing for NATO right now, when you realize that realistically, with the current administration in the United States and its position on this, looking at the various countries of Europe who've also spoken about this, there's just not support for Ukraine joining NATO right now. So Ukraine should be strategically wise and seek out other guarantees, other alliances that allow it to be guaranteed security without needing to count on the entire NATO organization. Now, I also think that it's very important to note that the NATO organization, at the end of the day, when you think of NATO, does anyone really worry if Portugal is going to come? I don't think anyone really cares. I think that when you talk about NATO, what you're worried about are the major countries there. So if you have a security guarantees, let's imagine with just the top several countries in NATO, you've already got more than half of NATO bought into this. And as far as military force goes, you have far more than half. So what else do you need? You don't really need the entire organization there. You really need to have multilateral or bilateral agreements with the specific countries that can actually back security guarantees.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, that's fair. I don't want to be harsh on Portugal. I love it and I go often, but okay, so let's look at Europe more specifically, not just through NATO or EU lens, but Europe as a continent, whatever vehicle they're going to be leveraging. Does this give, how much do you think Europe now has strategic momentum? Can we actually see Europe leveraging more combinations of smart power, hard power and soft power, the seizure of Russian tankers, the expulsion of interference, deterrence, or what Macron used for deterrence? There was that notable shift in French nuclear policy a month ago. What else do you think this means going forward in the short to medium term?
Well, I think that at this point, I think it's going to be very interesting to see what Europe does. I think it's pretty clear at this point that the way that it's organized, and frankly, I've not investigated this at length, but the way that it's organized, the fact that every country has this veto ability on different issues, is something that clearly doesn't work out as they'd hoped it would. And it's created a lot of tension and it's derailed a lot of progress for a number of years on a wide number of things, not only foreign policy vis-a-vis Russia, but on a lot of different issues as well. So I'm curious to see how Europe deals with that in the future. Now, it's also sort of interesting to see, speaking of NATO, though, we can go back to that, and it's the fundamental reason why I think the US won't ever leave NATO is, and I think that's just, it's a headline. I mean, whenever Donald Trump has a problem, notice he says something that's really bombastic that becomes a top news story, and everybody drops whatever else was in the news that was the day before the top story. The US makes a lot of money because of NATO. We have all the countries, a lot of countries, buying American weaponry, buying American goods, training with the United States, and it makes the United States have a critical role that what gives it relevance, and it opens up a lot of doors in many different ways. If you were to lose that, that would be very detrimental to the US military industrial complex, and that's something that would be very bad for Trump in any sort of election in the United States. I think that ultimately, though, this is just something that he brings up a lot. And keep in mind, there's also the law that got passed, which Rubio voted in favor of when he's still senator, to make it impossible for the president just to unilaterally pull out of NATO. But just do so, there's no real gain. The fact is, it's the U.S. is able, because of its position. For instance, I give a small example. When you look at military planning, they have different types of software that allow for command and control. That allows you to plan what's happening on the battlefield and how it all integrates. It's being done by US companies. Almost a great deal. I can't say everything, but I can say what I'm familiar with is that a great deal, at least, of the equipment that's being bought or different softwares that are being bought, the different developments that are being done, it's through American corporations. And that's something that
Mm,
benefits the US. That is the central linchpin of all of that. If you allow some other country to take that over, that could be a generational loss. That means the US can be pushed out of that. And at that point, to whom can you sell it to? You've already limited your market quite a bit. And that then puts the entire US military industrial complex at a huge disadvantage for global sales for years in the future, because a lot of these things are integrated systems. So I think that's simply not wise for US on an economic standpoint to really contemplate that with any sort of sincerity. At the same time,
mm,
Europe as a whole, I think, fortunately, is much more focused now on its own domestic security than it has been historically. They realize that the US is not a partner necessarily whom they want to count on, and a partner that they can necessarily count on. I mean, it could be very well that the next US president also decides to take positions very acrimonious towards NATO. But in all cases, I think that is going to be a time of change for Europe. But what do you think?
Well, I made it pretty clear in another video about my sentiments of Trump's comments around NATO. Now, I will also be honest that I'm a big fan of NATO, but I also think we could have done a better job in our relationship with Russia. But in the realities of what the modern world is, I support the alliance. I'm certainly not anti-NATO, but as you mentioned earlier, Jason, about the idea of foreign policy is just what you do to protect the interests and your domestic audience, right? I look at this from a European perspective. You're looking at it or framing it your points from an American one in one part, and I think it's incredibly important for Europe to be not entirely, but much more independent of the United States, not just Russia or China for relative reasons, but for the US as well. Now, can we do that? I mean, it's not that easy. America provides things that Europe just doesn't or isn't able to do yet. But I believe in Europe, perhaps a bit too naively, but I do think that we can. And I think that the idea of a NATO minus is plausible. I don't think that US is going to withdraw from NATO, not because also the NDAA, as you mentioned, right, the National Defense Authorization Act prevents him from doing that. But even if there was a way to sort of completely reduce American funding of NATO, I think that would actually help refocus NATO a little bit, because America has drawn NATO into Middle Eastern conflicts and some of its broader grand strategic interests, right? NATO is not something that's really meant to be geared towards China and the Southeast Asian theater. So it would help, I think, refocus NATO to its near abroad, to Europe, to the North Atlantic, to the Arctic, to Eastern Europe, to Southern Europe, and immigration or other sort of territorial insecurity. So, I think we need to be pragmatic in Europe, and I think that Hungary's shift is a big deal. But I'm not going to kid myself and get ahead of it and think that things are going to change over time. But certainly, I think it's an important opportunity and a big moment for Europe as well. And if we see a more favorable United States return, a more favorable president, administration, excuse me, back in, and hopefully then we can rekindle that. But right now it's not a reality, and I think Europe has to react and behave in that way. But I guess, moving forward to just sort of a final question for you, really, Jason, is, you know, if we're talking about this again in a couple months, the war in Iran is wrapped up. the war in Ukraine has become center stage again because the summer has allowed more military activity. What do you think we'll be seeing from all four major players, right? Because I'm now making Europe its own player, because I think, just to tag on to this, is in the past few weeks, when the Europeans really began exercising their confidence in policy, in the idea of pushing for that frozen assets, Putin really got rattled by that, didn't he? He really started directing his criticisms, threats, vulgarity to Europe, which he normally doesn't do. It's usually only to the United States and the White House, because that's how he sees the world, the great power politics. So how do you think in the next few weeks, Europe, the United States, Ukraine, and Russia are going to be behaving?
So I think that in the near term, a few different things could happen. My long-term view of Russia and the most substantial issue occurring within Russia outside the battlefield is what's going on in the banking sector. If you look at the lack of liquidity in the banking sector and the amount of toxic loans they have at major banks, look
Mm-hmm.
at Credit Russia. Swiss Credit, I think it was. I have to look it up.
Yeah.
Is they have about 27% toxic loans. It's estimated. Now that's a that's a massive amount. The fact that they have that much in a normal country would exceed say 5-6%. You would start to have all of a sudden the FDIC equivalent. The regulators come to help out because your bank could actually collapse, and that's serious. The fact that they're dealing with repo loans, that is, that the central bank comes and gives cash to banks so they can get through the week without running dry, is a very bad sign. But the overall lack of liquidity at the banks is significant. We've seen a huge amount of money move out month over month, and it's, by the way, you can look it up online. It's just substantial amounts are moving out. About 76% of the money that's taken out in a given month is not returned to the banking system, which further deprives it of liquidity. Hence, why you see nationalization of different industries right now. But neither here nor there. And by the way, the flight of you can look it up. Ask AI. The flight of different oligarchs who have left in the past few months, past 3 or 4 months, it's been increasing quite a bit. There's a lot of money leaving the country. Why that all matters, history shows that when your banking structure is not well organized, it's got a lot of debt. It's got a lot of debt that cannot be serviced, and that ultimately the central bank can't really help with that. Then you got big problems. Now, a lot of people say, like, look at 2008 in the United States, it had this whole problem. True, it did. Big difference is that the US dollar remained the reserve currency for a lot of countries. There's still a huge interest to buy US bonds to do business with US dollars. With the Russian ruble, there's not a lot of demand anywhere. Nobody really wants it. Their chance of being able to get some sort of significant buyout is about zero. If you look up the numbers of what's going on in the banking sector, according to NGOs that are financed by the Kremlin, in November, I think was the white paper that had come out, they said that there could be, quote, cascading defaults in the Russian banking sector within a year. That's an NGO close to the Kremlin. That's pretty alarming. And that's why I think that overall, I would keep my eyes most focused on what's happening in the banking sector. Watch what's happening there. I think that's the most important thing. But for the US, God knows what's going to happen tomorrow. I think that Europe's going to probably go along the same track that it's on, as well the UK. Um, but Russia, I think it has a very significant chance of having something, because this is what the NGOs close to the Kremlin said. This is what spokesmen of the Kremlin are saying. This is, once again, I cited earlier, the Minister of Defense of Russia said it's a critical situation on the front. This is not just, hope. This is, guys, these are government officials. So if they're saying that, I think there's probably a reason that they're alarmed.
Yeah, I think that's quite the point to highlight. If both the Russian war bloggers about the front line, let alone government officials and Kremlin-orientated or associated NGOs, are saying this, it's insane. I made a video, gosh, like 2 months ago now, talking about the cannibalization of Russia's economy. It's not just
It's
flatlining; it's
amazing.
eating itself out from the
It's,
inside.
I mean,
That's
look, 68% of Russians now say that they have a hard time paying for food. Sorry, 76% say that. 64% say that they buy food depending on if there's coupons or discounts that week for it, and that's how they determine what they buy. The overall situation for the average Russian is bad. But if you look at the major industries, there was a report that came out yesterday. I think it was Latvian intelligence was the one that released it, or it was the day before yesterday, saying that iron ore is down 50%. If you look at the cement industry, which is indicative of what's going on in construction, it's down about 80-90%. You look at home building in the Moscow region and surrounding areas, St. Petersburg as well, huge decreases. In fact, look at the Russian national railways. Russia has 11 time zones. Their Russian railways has currently has total corporate debt of about $53 billion. They've laid off another 6,000 people at their headquarters. They're about to lay off 20,000 more workers across the country. Without rails, more than 90% of goods in Russia travel by rail. That's absolutely incredible. Look what's happening with something like Selfcomfloat, which is the government shipping, they call it shipping by ship, transiting by ship. It's in a dire financial straits. I mean, the situation is really bad. And I think that what's funny to me is that all this data is public. This is not my opinion. I read the Russian news, anyone can. And it talks about this. Their leadership says that we need bailouts, and the government's saying we can't afford to do that. And if you're not able to bail out things like your railways, a country that has 11 time zones, that's serious. Or consider this. Look at the attacks at Ust-Luga up in the north and Primorsk. That's export facilities for oil and gas. That's where about 40% of Russia's total exports of oil go through. When those get struck by Ukraine, the secondary consequence of that, which a lot of people don't appreciate, is that it's not just a port. The pipelines are structured in Russia, built in the Soviet period, that they go from Siberia to those ports. It's not like there's other ports available. They can't just say, well, we're going to now send it over to the east part of the country. They don't have pipelines going there. They go to specific facilities where they put the barrels and they load them on. There's a way that this works. They can't just up and change everything. What is going on within Russia is that there's a systemic and I would say structural shift in what's occurring. And that is where you get to regimes becoming very destabilized quickly. But how do you see it?
Well, I would say simply that I'm not as informed on it as you are, because I've been enveloped by the war in Iran and US foreign policy. But simply put, look, even with the windfalls that have been coming from the Iranian oil shifts and Russia's ability to export more again, this is not enough to reverse the structural collapse, or the structural fragility is a better word, that the Russian economy is facing. We're so far in now that it's almost too far to reverse it, and anything Putin does is more of a temporary band-aid than it is a full-scale recovery. I'm pretty concerned about the extent it's going to really hit different communities hard, and then what comes after that. Putin doesn't seem to have any sort of contingency plan at all, and it's always just about trying to put on the saving face that everything's fine, when it just isn't. It really just isn't. And I do wonder what happens the day after tomorrow, because we could talk about X, Y, and Z, but Putin doesn't have a day after tomorrow. That's pretty clear, I think. And the fact, as you mentioned earlier, that he had to literally approach oligarchs as a way to say, hey, we'd like some additional war funding. Thanks very much. So I think, again, bottom line, regardless of what is happening on the battlefield, whether Russia's taken a little bit more of a territory or Ukraine is struggling because of manpower shortages or concern about funding, ultimately the biggest determinant in this is the Russian economy. Europe, just as a final figure, Jason, 400 billion is what the European military collective budget is. That's still more than the Russians and the Chinese combined, and that's without considering that Russia's in full max out wartime footing versus Europe, which isn't. Imagine what you do with Germany, France, and Britain in a more of a sort of similar setting to Russia. So I'm not entirely sure what Putin's trying to do with these provocations, and all the while the smoke and mirrors about the state of the Russian economy. One article in The Economist called it the death zone, right? Where it's a climbing metaphor, where you're so high up a mountain and you there's no way you can come back from it. And I just think it's a case of what time horizon are we talking about before we see an inevitable degradation, dissolution, whatever, disintegration of the Russian economy. It's quite late here, so I'm not being very coherent with my wording. But I don't know any last comments you want to make before we maybe sign off for this great conversation. But what would you encourage people to focus on? The Russian economy? Anything else on the Ukrainian side?
I think I'd focus first and foremost on the banking sector. I think that's going to be the most interesting thing that's happening in Russia. When you start to see that the central bank is starting to make radical movements, the past few months, we've seen they've restricted how much currency you can take out. They restricted how much you could take out from ATMs. They restricted how much you could take out per week. They've also left it to the discretion of bank tellers if you can take out your own money, which is probably a bad sign. But when you look at these different factors, look at these different things that are coming up. Also, look at the endless new stupid taxes and fines that they're pumping out constantly. At first, I didn't really understand what that was. I thought they were just trying to mother the population, but no, it's because they need capital. It's they need more fines because you produce more capital. So they got just endlessly new fines they're pumping out, which won't change anything in the grand scheme. But either way, I think I'd watch the economic situation in Russia first. Secondly, I think I'd watch very carefully what's happening in Kupiansk. If that starts to break, that would be huge. That will definitely change the outcome of the war. But third, I think what I think would be very important to watch is the moves with senior leadership within Russia, not just those who are officially in a government office like Putin, but those who are close proximity to the leadership of the country, those that have a large amount of resources, those who can sort of influence what is going to happen next. Historically, regimes, personal dictatorship like Putin's, the way that they end is when you start to see big shifts in that group. And if we'll get it to some other time, but if you look at the recent arrest within specifically the Shoigu faction within the Ministry of Defense, you look at his top deputies have all been arrested. I think 6 or 7 of them have resigned from the Ministry of Defense as well. You look at all this compiling at one time, it's very clear that the security services of Russia are trying to get rid of them because they are competition. The FSB has taken over a larger role in the country, namely of domestic industry, as well as taking over the ports in the country, as well as port security. But if you take over port security, it gives you another advantage, which allows you to create a racket because you need to know what's coming in and out of the country to have a racket over it. So I think when you look at all these things going on, there's a fight for limited resources at this point, and ultimately, I think it's going to come down to market forces that determine the future of this.
No, I'm inclined to agree, and the growing influence of the FSB sounds a bit like the IRGC in Iran and the securitization of the state. But Jason, smart, it's been an absolute pleasure as always to have you back on. Everyone, do like the video, do subscribe, and be sure to join us again when we get Jason back on. Maybe I'll join you on your channel at some
I'd love
point,
to.
Jason. But,
Sure.
yeah, thanks always, everyone.